Certainly not exaggerating when I say if it wasn't for him, we as a synesthetic community wouldn't be in the place we are today.
And that's really one of the astonishing things about synesthesia. A tiny change in one of your nucleotides completely alters how someone sees the world. And they shook their heads and said, "Oh man, you stay away. It'll ruin your career."
I could taste things that weren't there. For example, the building itself gave me a very strong banana flavour.
One of the great things about science is that you can be wrong. Well, the question is synesthesia real? And the question really then is real to whom? To you or to the skeptics who are insisting on a third-person explanation for a first-person experience?
All right, now I am sitting here with James Wannerton once again, third time on the podcast. Hi, James. How are you doing today?
Oh, Maike, I'm fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining me, and thank you so much for connecting me with today's guest. I'm so excited. Can you please give us an introduction who we are going to interview today?
Yeah, sure. Well, today we're in conversation with who I conceive to be a very special guest, Dr. Richard Cytowic. He's a clinical professor of neurology at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Richard is revered within the field of neurology and in particular with the international synesthesia community because of his dogged determination and his pioneering work when he reignited the study of synesthesia. Not only this, I mean, Richard is a joy to know, but he's also an accomplished and an award-winning speaker and author. That's it, really.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm so curious to hear. I think I'm going to add a poll to the episode on Spotify where people can tell me whether they heard about Richard before or not, because I feel equally honored to meet him today and a little bit embarrassed that I didn't know his name before. But I guess you can't know everybody. So
no, I mean, I was going to say I've been friends with Richard for close on 20 years, and he's someone again I've always greatly admired, and I'm certainly not exaggerating when I say if it wasn't for him, we as a synesthetic community wouldn't be in the place we are today. And really, we all owe him a depth of gratitude that I personally find quite difficult to express in mere words.
did you ever have the chance to tell him? Did you ever meet him in person in your 20 years of friendship?
Oh, yeah. We've met on a number of occasions. The last time was in Moscow in 2019, I think it was.
Nice.
It was a number of years ago. Yeah, he's a fantastic man. He's witty, very erudite, and an amazing person to know.
Well, couldn't ask for anything better for today's episode. And it's also such a good topic for the first year anniversary of the podcast to look back on the history of synesthesia. We wrote down a couple questions. Do you want to give us a quick overview over what kind of questions we're going to ask Richard in just a bit?
What I'd be really interested in, because he's a leading expert on synesthesia, and it'd be quite interesting to hear his definition of what synesthesia is and where it comes from. That would be interesting.
Yeah.
And also, when he started the study of synesthesia or rekindled it, it was over 40 years ago, and that's a long time ago. And,
It is.
And it was, again, as I said earlier, this was at a time when people just regarded this as a weird trait, maybe even new age, if you like.
Oh my God, he just joined us.
All right.
I did. I didn't think you were going to be audio.
Okay, well, today we're in conversation with a very special guest, Dr. Richard Cytowic. He's a clinical professor of neurology at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Richard is revered within the field of neurology and in particular with the international synesthesia community because of his dogged determination and pioneering work reigniting the study of synesthesia following decades of obscurity and widespread skepticism within academia. And not only is Richard a joy to know, he's also an accomplished and an award-winning speaker and author. He's written several highly acclaimed books on synesthesia, including Synesthesia, A Union of the Senses, The Man Who Tasted Shapes, and Wednesday is indigo blue. So, welcome, Richard. It's indeed an honour and a privilege to have this opportunity of speaking with you today. So, thank you.
It's nice to be here. My pleasure.
Right. Well, I'll begin with the first question. As a leading expert on synesthesia, can I ask you to briefly give us your own definition of what synesthesia is and where it comes from?
I like to use the analogy of anesthesia, which means no sensation. Everybody knows that word. So synesthesia means joined or coupled sensations. And it's a coupling of perceptions, most often having to do with sensation. There's a strong genetic factor, which why it runs in families. And in fact, it's so common that 1 in 23 people carry the genes for synesthesia. So this is a genetic preponderance for having a perceptual trait. It's like perfect pitch. You either have it or you don't. You can't develop it. It's apparent at a very early age. And once you have it, it stays with you pretty much for your whole life.
Do you think there's synesthesia's sort of a spectrum as well? Because my own mother had synesthesia, and oddly enough, her Wednesdays were blue. She used to associate days of the week with specific colours, and it used to control what she wore, the colour clothes she wore, which was quite amazing. She'd wear green on Tuesdays, blue on Wednesdays, and brown on Fridays.
It is very common that it influences the way people perceive the world as well. And that's really one of the astonishing things about synesthesia. You know, a tiny change in one of your nucleotides completely alters how someone sees the world. And it can influence their mood and their predilections and their preferences.
I have a question for you too. So I did a bunch of research in preparation for this episode, and I listened to another interview. And my first question for you would be, since you've been in synesthesia research for over 40 years, do you have synesthesia? And I think you don't. So my question is, how did you pick synesthesia as your field of research?
No, I am not synesthetic. But first of all, how could I not be interested in it? I mean, I'm naturally curious. The topic it's so offbeat and unusual. I mean, it's a puzzle that begged to be solved. And I think one thing that persuaded me to keep going was my colleagues' reaction when I told them about Michael Watson, my first subject, who was the man who tasted shapes. They said, "Well, what does his CAT scan show?" And I said, No. He doesn't have a hole in his head. He's not missing anything. He's got something extra. This is what we call an elevated function in neurology. And they shook their heads and said, "Oh man, you stay away from this. It's too weird, too new age. It'll ruin your career." And I encountered a lot of resistance like that. And I thought, why are people so defensive? I mean, it's just a perception that people have, and yet they're acting as if it's threatening in some way. And I thought, this is probably something rather important too. And of course, also it has to do with just overcoming. I mean, that their reaction is the typical nature of orthodoxy, which is to either explain away or deny what an authority cannot or does not wish to understand. So a lot of so-called experts have their perspective frozen in place, and they're not open to new evidence that goes against their settled way of thinking. I think a large factor too, which didn't occur to me at the time, it took many decades, and that has to do with the fact that I'm gay. So as a 10-year-old in New Jersey, my father's medical profession said that I was sick. The state said that I was a criminal, and the church said that I was damned to hell. And I hadn't done anything. And I thought, they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know me. So I wasn't supposed to exist, just as synesthesia wasn't supposed to exist. I had heard this before, and it went counter to all the prevailing ideas at the time of how the brain was organized.
Yeah, your experience as a queer man was kind of, you could relate to the experience of not being understood as a synesthete because you felt pathologized in a similar way than a synesthete that did.
Right, the outlier, the unusual, the exception kind of thing.
Yeah.
But, an adage of science is nature usually reveals herself through her exceptions. and synesthesia turned out to be the case, is that, at the time, modularity was the rule. That is, the brain was thought to have distinct modules that by definition did not interact with one another. So you had a speech module and one for arithmetic, one for each of the senses, a motor module and all that. So obviously synesthesia absolutely didn't agree with that kind of organization, but that was the dogma at the time.
Being a synesthete myself, and certainly within my own personal experience, I initially came across a lot of denial as to the legitimacy and reality of the trait. This was back in the late 1990s. The reasons given were such like I was just simply making it up, or I was attention seeking. The use of metaphor used to come up quite a lot as well. Or it was simply a case of remembering associations I made during childhood. How did you go about sort of disproving such widely accepted misconceptions?
Well, the question is synesthesia real? And the question really then is real to whom? To you or to the skeptics who are insisting on a third person, usually technological explanation for a first person experience? And that usually means, pictures of the brain. And at the time when I did my first, brain scan, as it very rudimentarily was back in 80, 83, things they just weren't sensitive enough to see much of anything. And then as time grew and the refinement became more precise, and we had things like fMRI, then you indeed showed that this was a genuine brain phenomenon, and the critics had to shut up because they got the pictures that they insisted on all the time. But you can show this synesthesia is real with paper and pencil. You don't need $1 million machines. And typical optical illusions are another way that you can show that synesthetes and their reaction time. For example, if I show you a matrix of fives in which I've embedded a hidden figure made out of twos, it'll take most people a while to search and find the hidden shape, a square, a rectangle, whatever. Whereas synesthetes who see twos as differently colored from fives very quickly say, oh, it's a triangle. There it is. So this sort of pops out, as it were.
Yeah, because fMRIs played what I think they played a very important part in the acceptance of synesthesia, certainly in the UK. Again, back in the late 1990s, the only tests we had for synesthetes were consistency tests. I mean, that was it. It used to drive me mad. I submitted a list of 3,000 words and 3,000 flavours attached to each of those words, and they'd regularly ring me up and ask me sort of 50 or 60 of them, and just to see if there was consistency there. But that was all we ever had. And I found it very, very gratifying to actually look at a fMRI scan once it had been analysed to see something physical there. It was really good. It was sort of like a moment of epiphany for me.
I told you so, right?
Yeah. I mean,
but even with that, I remember at a conference in Hanover, Germany, there's this neurosurgeon, and he had given a presentation and showed the thing, and he says, well, see, this proves that synesthesia is real. And I just rolled my eyes and thought, where have you been all these years? You don't need a scan to show that it's real. There are many other ways to do it. So...
yeah,
making it up, the idea where you're just remembering childhood associations from coloring books or refrigerator magnets. Well, it runs strongly in families, so how could it be just memory unless mothers were handing down the same magnet sets from child to child? So there's a lot of there are a number of problems with the typical explanations, including one you didn't talk on, is that, well, they're just having a residual hallucinations from a youth of the pot smoking and LSD, and that's why they're seeing colors and stuff. But of course, all the usual making it up one's attention, they're just remembering doesn't explain the very high specificity in the fact that, as you said, you give them a list of hundreds of things, and without warning, you spring it on them later, and you get exactly the same kind of responses. And so just remembering isn't going to cut it. And besides, some people have tried to teach people to be synesthetic by memorizing associations, but their performance is still just around chance level, even though they've had their cheat sheet with them.
Because the fridge magnet connection is quite an interesting one, because that used to come up quite a lot as well here. But also, certainly when I was at school, we every classroom had a blackboard with coloured letters. It was our way of learning the alphabet.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. I had that too in kindergarten and first grade. And in fact, there are some people who have imprinted on refrigerator magnets. That is, the mother has saved it in the attic, and the Fisher Price stopped making it, I think, in the early 90s. And you can show that the colors are in that orderly array that were on the thing. But the fact that a very small number of people can imprint does not mean that that is the explanation in all cases of synesthesia. So that just says something about the malleability and the plasticity of the brain, that it's able to do that.
So again, going back to your to the, I'll call it opposition. The opposition you had when you first started studying this. I mean, what gave you the inspiration and determination to carry on? Because
because the initial data that I got was fairly convincing, at least to me, and and then I think it was my first scientific presentation. It was the International Neuropsychological Society in Atlanta, God knows, way back in the early 80s. And they have a press operation, and so they want you to come with like 25 copies of your paper to put in the press room, and interested journalists will pick it up, and then they'll contact you if they want to interview you. Well, it was like getting gangbang journalism. I mean, everybody was interested in this. So many that I once gave an interview to 7 journalists at once. So it's like, wow, these people are really interested, and yet the scientific colleagues are, oh, tisk, no, this can't be. And I thought, well, that tells you something right there. Why is it so popular in the imagination? And again, I said, what harm is there in looking at it? One of the great things about science is that you can be wrong. And if you're wrong, you say, well, that didn't pan out. And all that tells you is that you need to go bark up another tree. It's no humiliation. So it's just a question of persistence and again, fascination. I had one journalist, and he said, Dr. Cytowic, when I talk to other researchers, it's all like, well, there's these receptors and, we're looking for genetic markers. He says, when I talk to you, it's like, wow, these people are so fascinating. And it's true. He says, you get to know these people, and I'm just in awe of the things what their life is like, the texture of their reality. And I think this is what's really hard for non-synesthetes, especially skeptics, to understand, is that synesthetes simply have a different texture of reality than you or I do. And then they say, well, all the stuff that they're seeing, doesn't it drive them crazy? And it's like, well, no more than seeing a blind person saying to you, oh my God, everywhere you look, you're always seeing something. Doesn't it drive you crazy, always having to see things? And it's like, no, because vision is part of the texture of our reality, just as being blind and having no visual input is the texture of a blind individual's reality. And by the way, the incidence of synesthesia is higher in blind individuals than in the general population. And that makes sense because yes, they have all this unused, in the V1 in particular, they have all this unused visual cortex, and the brain doesn't like, real estate sitting empty. And so other functions then encroach on that area. Just the way that in string musicians, the bowing hand, the sensory representation of the bowing hand grows larger with each year that they play the violin, because
No way.
you need more neural real estate to be able to be a great musician like that. And then if they stop, it reverts. So, and you can show these different kinds of sensory substitutions experiments. So if you blind volunteers for 2 days, all of a sudden their visual cortex starts responding to sounds and something in touch. So there's synesthesia right there. Well, 2 days is too short of time for new connections to grow. So the connections must be there already, but unused so long as vision is inputting a signal. And then once you take
Right.
the blindfold off, within just 12 hours, their V1 visual cortex reverts back to responding only to vision. It's pretty
Okay.
fascinating. Yeah.
So before we dive a bit more into the history, I have one more question, which is vaguely related to what you just said. And it's a question someone asked me just like a couple days ago. Colorblind people, can they, in their mind's eye, see a color that they can't see in real life? Do you know anything
Correct.
about that?
Yes.
They can.
Well, Ramachandran has a famous subject with S-cone deficiencies, which makes it difficult for him to perceive blues and purples. And yet he
Right.
speaks of seeing Martian colors. So he sees colors that he's incapable of seeing in the real physical world because he lacks the receptor in his retina. And yet, so where's the color coming from? It's coming from his brain. So, people say, oh, something looks red because it reflects more red wavelengths, but there are no such thing as red wavelengths. Even Sir Isaac Newton said there is no color in the rays. The color is in the brain. And we have two color areas, V4 and a smaller one more interior to that.
That makes so much sense. Thank you for explaining. It's hard to believe, or like it's easy to believe, but at the same time, I wasn't sure if it's possible or not because it's just so.
Yeah, we had. I remember in the Derek Sayers Severe Wax documentary, you had a congenital blind person who described colours really, really well. It's absolutely
I have
fascinating.
to go look at that again. That was great.
So I have a question to dive a bit deeper into the history. So you gave synesthesia research a big boost 40 years ago when you started to look into it, even though your peers weren't interested or were skeptical. What happened prior to your research? Because synesthesia was already a term, right? You knew what it was. So what happened before?
Yes, it was. I learned the word only because I like to escape to the sub basement of the library where nobody went and where the page operator's signal couldn't reach. And so I'd spend 5-10 minutes sit down looking at these old books. And I came across Luria's book, The Mind of a Mnemonist, in which he described this memory expert who had a five-fold synesthesia. And that's why he could remember limitless amounts of material. And I love
Wow.
words. So I filed it away in the back of my mind. I said, oh, anesthesia, synesthesia. Ooh, what a great, nice root that is.
Yeah.
And so that when I encountered Michael Watson, he was a new faculty member at the School of the Arts, taught lighting design, and he invited me to meet some people for dinner and delayed us by saying, oh, it will be a few minutes. There aren't enough points on the chicken. At which point his friend said, oh, Michael, what are you smoking now? And he turned to me, beet red, and said, well, maybe you'll understand. You're a neurologist. I have this thing that when I taste flavor, I feel it on my face and in my hands. And I said, oh, you have synesthesia. I mean, I was just trying to be polite. But he just stopped dead in his tracks and said, you mean there's a name for what I do? And that was another impetus to go on. I thought, how could he not know what he has? I mean, this is like unbelievable. So, I went back to the library and looking at more old dusty stuff. And sure enough, there was tons of literature going back 200 years.
What kind of literature?
Well, these were in medical journals, psychological journals, etc. So they
Right.
were, and they were in French and they were in German. There's some in English, but very few, and some very, very detailed ones. And then there were some books too, again in French and English. Um, so that's why Synesthesia Union of the Senses was the first book ever in English on this topic. So the research is all there. And the first report that I think is scientifically recognizable in terms of the way that we report such cases now came from Sir Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin, who wrote about visualized numerals over a century ago. I think that was 1904. So, yeah, there were a lot of people who were making these observations of the whole person behavior and describing it, quite in terms. Galton was he said, what's really interesting is the absolute heightened particularity of it. Is that the subject says they mean a particular blue, a very specific shade, and nothing else. And if when they try to match it with different colors of yarn, for example, or crayons, they can never find the exact color that matches what their synesthetic color is, for example. So he mentioned this high particularity and the fact that it seemed to be a lifelong trait. And once you have it, you always have it, and the colors and associations are always the same.
Because I remember I visited Jamie Ward, Professor Jamie Ward. He was at UCL at the time, I think, and he showed me a piece of paper. It was a research paper by somebody called Ferrari, I do believe, if I remember correctly, dated 1907, and all this was a list of words with a list of food. And to see that, it was gobsmacking. I mean, I couldn't believe it. But that was fairly early on. That was sort of in the early 2000s. But this was dated 1907. I think it was French in origin. But
yeah, there are, and like in America too, David Jordan Starr, who was a very well-known psychologist at the time in America, wrote about it. His son was synesthetic, and so what you got then was the benefit of a fairly detailed observation by a scientist who's sort of able to cut through the embroidery and just state what the perception is like.
because that's what I really love about synesthesia. It's the detail. It's the depth of detail is absolutely amazing, and I've always found that amazing. Because, like you say, the colours are very specific, very particular.
In my own case, I mean, I like music, and I have an incredible memory for it's like a photographic memory for sounds. And so the timbre and resonance of different sounds and recordings, and I remember them with great specificity, and often they're some of them sound like a racket to an outside observer. I mean, take Olivier Messiaen's Truant and Galila Symphony, which is like, oh my God, what a racket this is! But it's actually very melodic, and the timbres are very, very pleasing, I find. So in that way, I may be analogously sensitive in the way that a synesthete is to the particularity of a perception.
Have you any idea as well when the very first report the very first medical documentation of a synesthete appeared or was published? Because I've heard it was sort of mid 1800s.
Well, there are, but again, they're so hard to judge in today's terms, so that the Galton is really the first one that is presented in a way that is recognizable in terms of a scientific approach or reportage. I think if you really want to know the history, I would go to your library and ask for the Oxford Encyclopedia of Synesthesia, and there's, I think, 22 chapters by different people, expertise in their particular area. And it's just fascinating to read and to see the illustrations and the photographs. And
I've got a copy of that.
I think one of the surprising things was how strongly it runs in families. I've had up to 4 living generations at once. David Eagleman crashed a wedding that had a synesthetic bride and examined 123 of her relatives and found a huge number of synesthetes in that wedding among the wedding guests. But then the puzzle is you come across people who say, well, I asked all of my families and my aunts and uncles and nobody has it. So, like, what gives? And I think the answer is that is a new mutation, and so that individual is the first in the next line of having synesthesia, and it makes sense because 4% of the population contain the synesthesia genes, and that's a really big number for a trait that's quite pretty but outwardly not very useful. So evolution, it must be doing something very important. Otherwise, evolution would have jettisoned it long ago. Go back before we had psychology. I mean, American psychology didn't get going until the late 1800s, and most people had never heard the terminology of it and all that. So if you go back even further, and there are people who see auras around people, well, they were considered to be witches or gifted in some way, and when in fact they might have had emotionally mediated synesthesia. Or again, they're judged in some way. They're judged in the context of their time, which was not scientific at all. It was always folklore and suspicion. In the same way that epileptics were regarded as sacred and divine, when they had these shaking fits, nobody knew what that was. They didn't think, oh, the brain is having spikes in the temporal lobe. No, the people didn't know anything about that. They were like, this person is shaking on the ground and foaming at the mouth. And my God, they're struck by God.
I've never heard that before. That makes
Oh,
so much sense. Yeah, it makes so much sense that you would just interpret it in your cultural or religious beliefs.
in the context of what you
Yeah.
know, your Umwelt, the Umwelt means the environment around which you are, and so
Yeah,
like
it's German.
a fish has an Umwelt that's based on water. Okay, we have a different kind of Umwelt, so context is important.
Definitely.
I think one of the nice things about that so many people, young people, got involved in synesthesia is that you really had this burgeoning of research and interest. Back in the 80s and 90s, I would get phone calls and letters from graduate students who would say, oh, I'd love to do my thesis on synesthesia, but my chairman would never let me. They'd kick me out of the program. So we then, somewhere along the line, we reached the stage where people weren't afraid to talk about synesthesia and say, gee, maybe I found this person, or two people, and let's do an experiment, and they did.
I have another question for you. It's more of a two-part question. If we look at synesthesia research of the last 50 or 100 years, what do you think would be the biggest milestones? And I think fMRI was probably one of them. And
well,
the second part of my question.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. I'm just going to leave it there and you can do with it whatever you want. The second half is, where do you think research is going to go, or what are your hopes for synesthesia research in the future?
Well, one of the more important pieces of discoveries is not so much about synesthesia per se, but discovery in 1989 of the visual color area in humans, V4. Now, we tend to think that V4 has been around forever and we've always known about it. And so 89 was when my first book came out. So it was discovered just at the time of publication. And Samir Zeki at University College London did a lot of work in monkeys that mimicked work in color research that Edward Land, the inventor of Polaroid, had done. So just knowing that there's this unique color area, now we know that there's two areas, allowed a number of experiments to take place.
Right.
So it was just we have a new data point. So now what are we going to do with it? Well, let's see how we can manipulate it and enhance or withhold or whatever. So that was important. The other would be, I think, the genetics, that realizing that this is I realized back in 84 or whenever, 89, I guess, when the book came out, that this is an autosomal dominant trait. So that means that either parent can pass it down to either gender child and so on down the line. And that's why you see it in multiple generations. So that, and then science progressed alongside, and we were able to start doing gene markers. So, you spit in the test tube and get your DNA. And I mean, that's like mind blowing. And so now you've got a new technical tool that you're able to apply to synesthesia. So synesthesia seems to be like really handy of exploiting all this new these new discoveries that we come up with. And in the process of doing that, it gives us surprising results. Now, the second part of your question is, where do I think, or I hope, the research is going? One of my favorites, and this is really really difficult, is studying it in very young children, including newborns and infants. Because then the question is, we know from people like, Piaget and other people who study development, uh, we know the milestones that babies hit, when they are able to crawl, when they can recognize certain shapes, when they learn to, speak, have two words, etc. And so it would be great if we could match up that sequence, which is pretty predictable across people. I mean, the time frames are slightly different, but everybody goes through these same milestones. And is the kind of synesthesia that they have related in any way to the development of these cognitive and physical milestones? So I think that would be interesting, because that would tell us a little bit more about the mechanism of how synesthesia gets established in the first place. I mean, you've got to have this propensity to connect different areas of the brain, but then you must also be exposed to cultural artifacts like alphabets and the names of the foods that you eat and so on, and calendars. So where does this coupling take place, and how does it do it? I mean, I think that's
Right.
that's a question for molecular genetics and biochemistry, and maybe the next generation of imaging instead will help get us there. And that may not happen for another 20 years, but oh my, it would be really interesting.
Sounds like a very hard study to conduct and probably really expensive to do, but it's
Well,
amazing.
yeah, no, that's what the challenge is. Studying any kind of perception is very,
Yeah.
very messy. Don't forget, when I was a young resident in neurology, I was interested in aphasia. In fact, I wrote a paper about aphasia in the composer Maurice Ravel. And that got me labeled philosophically minded because, you see, aphasia and language really weren't part of neurology. And in fact, neither was memory. You had demented people, Alzheimer's disease. People could care less about it. That wasn't an interest of a topic of interest. And so these were sort of taboo subjects because they were all subjective. And seeing subjective stuff is inherently messy, but I think that's one of the really fun aspects about synesthesia is that, yeah, it's messy, but people have been tackling it bit by bit here and there. And so I think the future that I described is, you're quite right. Yes, that's very, very messy. Studying anything in young children is really hard to do, but people do it.
Because you're probably aware of this, Richard, but Jamie Ward's he ran a project. I think he called it originally 100 brains, and then it changed to 300 or 500 or
Yeah.
however many he managed to collect together. But this was it was done with the intention of creating a questionnaire that he could give to people to find out whether they had synesthesia. And of course, the questionnaire didn't have any questions about synesthesia on there. And he used this to create some sort of brain map. I think there's probably a technical term for that. It looks a bit like a disjointed spider's web. But the interesting thing there is that he reckons that he can predict with up to 85%, I think is the percentage figure he was coming up with, 85% accuracy that the person has got synesthesia or not, depending on this on the results of these of this questionnaire.
Yeah, if I remember, yeah, go ahead.
Well, just saying that would be a way of testing children because he says it can be used for children as well.
Yeah,
Uh,
if I'm remembering it correctly, he came up with a probabilistic model of what's the likelihood of your having synesthesia based on, I guess, some of these factors that he's weighing. So yes, that could be, he might usher us into a new area of research in children, and yeah, very young children. Of course, the problem with that is making sure you get an accurate report, because uh, they're most likely to embroider things. So, and
yeah,
by
that's true.
embroider, I mean embellish, rather than just saying, well, it's red and it's square and it moves to the right, sparkles. They'll give you, oh, it's a pumpkin coach or a race car. They interpret what their perception is. They haven't yet learned how to observe the perception. And this was Heinrich Kluver's consternation when he started studying hallucinations in LSD and psilocybin, is that the subjects would tend to what he called embroider their responses, and they would give cosmic or religious meaning to what they were experiencing. And he had to train them with examples, slides that he would show of just report to me what the perception is. Don't give me your interpretation of what it means or what it is. Just give me the bare bones. But you need to be an adult and fairly trained and fairly what's the word I want? Precise and willing to suppress your automatic instincts to respond in a certain way. So I think that would be really hard to do in children. But again, I'm all for messy research.
Yeah, I'm rather hoping he'll expand on it all at the conference in Oxford once coming up in May, because he's one of the keynote speakers there.
Will you be there, Richard?
I don't know. I have to look at my calendar. I'll see. It's tempting. We'll see. I haven't traveled since the pandemic.
Right. Oh, it would be lovely to meet you in person.
It's always interesting having a meal with James, because after descriptions of things, it's wonderful. And same thing with Michael Watson. Going to a restaurant with Michael Watson, the man who tasted shapes, was again what an experience that was.
Yeah, it's really good. We remember I did meet another taste synesthete, and we were actually filmed. It was by the Discovery Channel people. We were actually filmed having a conversation in a crowded restaurant about all our sensations, and it was really weird looking at other people who were earwigging and having a listen and seeing their faces. It was really odd.
James, what questions do you have left? Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, because I think we don't have much more time, and I have one more question to end on. So,
I would sort of like to know, because I'm often asked about the most unusual and fascinating personal stories about people with synesthesia, people with really odd types. I mean, have you, Richard? I mean, you must have. You've obviously interviewed hundreds and hundreds of synesthetes. Have you got any really unusual ones or fascinating ones you could
Other than
share with
you
us?
and Michael, I mean, they're all interesting in their own
Yeah,
way,
it's
because
true. Mm.
it's unique to each individual. And I think that's one of the takeaways from synesthesia, is that it shows that uh, each of us has a uniquely subjective point of view, and difference is what defines us. It's very gratifying to have young students, or doing book reports on this or something, uh, having the light bulb go off and saying, "Oh my God, Mary sees the world differently than I do. Everybody sees things differently than I do," and hopefully that will uh, take the edge off the consternation that's really floating around the globe right now with politics and religion and whatnot. So I think opening us up to the sensitivity and the understanding that other people know things too. People don't see the world the way I do, and then when we get to other cultures, it's like, yeah, they totally see things differently than I do, because they're brought up in this foreign. It really is a foreign culture, and so the American or the British one isn't always the right one. It's just one.
because I'm always interested in the stories. Like I think it was Julian Asher who studied
Hmm.
genetics, didn't he, within synesthesia. He used to say that when he went to the theatre, the reason he thought that the lights went down was because they could see the musical notes in colour a lot clearer.
God, that's
So
adorable.
Yeah, it gave them a dark canvas on which to see their moving shapes.
yeah, it's
That's
fascinating.
so nice. I think, James, you also wanted to ask Richard what kind of synesthesia form he would like to have if he could experience one for a day.
Yes, it's a bit of a general one, and it is rather personal. But again, you've actually confirmed it. You're not a synesthete yourself, but if you could experience a type of synesthesia, which one do you think you would go for?
Oh, that's almost a pointless question because I can no longer
Mm,
change the way I see the world, and synesthetes can change the way they see theirs. So, but if I could wave a magic wand or something, I suppose it'd be one that gave me a greater sense of memory. Uh, so I would have to say it would be one of the visual ones with the
Well, I
colored
think taste
hearing,
as
or
well. Yeah.
well, that's not really going to help my memory very much.
No,
So
that's what I mean. James
yeah,
always says that his taste synesthesia helps him so much to memorize things, doesn't it,
yeah. I mean,
James?
I couldn't. Yeah,
true, yeah. Because again, he has these strange hooks to hang things on and all that. And
Exactly.
yet, I know I have an acquaintance, and she has a exquisite. She grew up sailing on the Normandy and all that. But so she has a first class palate, and she can remember every meal she's ever eaten and describe it in great detail, and then where and when and who else was there and all that. And it's like, Barbara, how do you do this? I don't know. So she's wired differently but so nice to have as a friend.
yeah. Well, going on about memory hooks. I mean, I can remember being taken to where I was brought up. I was taken there. It was a BBC thing, but they took me there simply for me to describe entering a tube station.
Hmm.
But the odd thing was that whenever I looked around that street, I could taste things that weren't there. For example, the building itself, or a building there, gave me a very strong banana flavour. I had no idea why, because I was looking at it thinking, well, there's nothing on there that I can link, but I still had this thing in the background. And the BBC very helpfully managed to dig out some really old photographs of this shop,
Hmm.
and it was the numbers on there. It was 993, I think it was 993. That was the number of the shop, but that was where I was getting the banana flavors from. Because as soon as I saw that photograph, it took me back.
Ah.
That's incredible.
And there was another one where I got a taste of pear drops, and the reason for that was when looking at this old photograph, and again I pointed out the pear drop thing. I'm getting a pear drop from that area, was simply because there was a lamppost there back in the 60s. It was the early 60s, and it was that I was getting the taste of pear drops from, because whenever I look at a lamppost, I get a taste of pear drops.
Hmm.
But that's the memory links I find really fascinating.
Yeah, and I
Absolutely
think that's
fascinating.
probably what's most useful. So whatever is going to jog my memory. So
Yeah, well, I've finished my questions. That was pretty fascinating, Richard. Thank you.
thank you very much
Yeah.
for having me.
But if I'd also like to say, it's fantastic to have you still around as part of the international synesthesia community,
I've
because we
become
all
the
appreciate.
eminence grise. They rolled me out to give an introductory talk to the conference. I don't have to
No,
do very much anymore. So,
no, we know you as the Godfather.
uh,
Yeah, but thank you for that, and thank you for being a continuing inspiration, because there's future generations of neurology researchers that don't know what you've done, and I think that's a real shame. But now they will.
well, I hope I can inspire them to keep digging away.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, it's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so, so much. And also thank you on behalf of our listeners and Instagram followers for everything you've did, everything you've done. Wow. Brain fog is kicking in. Thank you so much for taking the time today and just sharing your knowledge and biography and everything you did, so we can confidently talk about our synesthesia today, which is awesome.
Yeah, it's
It's
an
my
amazing
pleasure.
legacy, Richard. Amazing legacy. Yeah, really, really good. Fantastic.
Yeah.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to Let's Talk Synesthesia. If you enjoyed listening, you can like, follow, and share. Details about the podcast and how to connect with today's speakers can be found in the show notes. The executive producer was Maike Pricing, with music by Corinne Anderson, and the podcast was supported by a couple more neurodivergent people in the background. See you next week.